Thank you and welcome to the September edition of the Planet Technologies Cloud Office Hours. This month's edition is going to be on Microsoft 365 security. We have a guest speaker, Michael Brunetti, Director of Modern Workplace Advanced Workloads from Microsoft. We don't often have guest speakers on this session, so we're excited to have one today. My name is Bob Ballard. I'm the Principal Cloud Strategist for Planet Technologies. So welcome everybody. Your URDOTA team is myself, Jerry Martin, Aaron Ward, George Scott, Scott Dowling from the Cloud Strategist team, as well as Mary Tucker to keep us all in line. And it's all brought to you by the capability and guidance of our Vice President, Steve Winter. Super excited for the topic today. We've got a lot of feedback from customers around it. So one last thing, don't forget, as a URDOTA customer, you can reach out as part of your URDOTA benefits. Okay. Reach out as part of your URDOTA benefits to the URDONIT at go-planet.com. If you have any questions, concerns, need guidance, you guys are our best customers. And that's why you get invited to this webcast, and we're happy to help you. Our SLA is 24 hours with some sort of response, and we'd like to get you an answer by 48 hours. So please feel free to use it. With that, I'm going to welcome Michael Brunetti, the Director of Modern Workplace Advanced Workloads, to give what is, we've got a lot of feedback from some customers of ours that this is, an excellent and different than typical way to sort of lay out how all the pieces and parts fit together. So I'm really excited to bring Michael on to sort of walk through the way he paints the picture, because I think you'll find a lot of value in that. Thanks for joining us today, Michael.
Thanks, Bob, for having me. I'm going to go ahead and share my desktop here. If you can let me know when that comes up.
I see it. I see it.
Excellent.
Yep.
Okay. Thanks, Bob. So this conversation is about Microsoft 365 focused on our identity and security solutions in the suite. What I've got on the screen here is kind of an overview of the new license model, Microsoft 365, that we introduced approximately 2 years ago. And it represented a kind of a dramatic change in licensing that has occurred. In the past 10 years or so, we've had the core licensing of our agreements with customers the same across the desktop license. But as customers have shifted to the cloud, we've been making a dramatic amount of investments in identity and security solutions around cloud services. And so about 2 years ago, we re-swizzled our licensing model to Microsoft 365 to incorporate some of those and bundle those pieces together, including the features that are in the Office 365 suite, as well as the features in the EMS suite. And because of that, we have a lot of customers now that have this new licensing program that don't necessarily understand everything that they have available to them from a feature perspective, nor how these pieces work together or how to integrate the puzzle. So because of that, over the past couple of months, I've been having a lot of conversations with customers and whiteboarding out our security and identity strategy and how these pieces work together to try and inform customers about the capabilities that in most cases they already own. We then turned this kind of whiteboard session into a slide deck with a lot of animations to try and represent the information that I've been discussing with customers. So we'll jump right into it. So our security strategy at Microsoft really falls into 3 core areas: identity and access management, threat protection, and information protection. I'm going to take you through all the pieces of Microsoft 365 that fall in these areas and talk about how they work together as well. So the core to identity and access management for Microsoft has always been Active Directory. So Active Directory was introduced about 20 years ago, and it really was designed to be a centralized directory where at first, users could log in with their credentials from any workstation, but then applications that you deployed on-premise could leverage Active Directory as a single sign-on mechanism. So you didn't have to deploy a new directory for every application. We could leverage this as the centralized directory, and certainly a lot of customers and a lot of applications took advantage of that. If you fast forward to the cloud, we recognized as we launched cloud services, we needed a similar directory service in the cloud to satisfy those needs. And that is Azure Active Directory. And so customers typically, when they get started with Office 365, for example, will synchronize their identities from on-premise Active Directory to Azure Active Directory. And now they've got a presence for identity in the cloud. What customers don't realize is that this identity service can be used well beyond Office 365 for other services as well. It's a centralized identity service, certainly. It can be used for authorization of applications. It can also be used as an IDP, or you can leverage a third-party IDP such as ADFS or any third-party solution. But there are a lot of features just wrapped into Azure Active Directory, especially when we're talking about Azure AD Premium, which is included in Microsoft 365. So first and foremost is a single sign-on solution for cloud applications. So we have a catalog of about 3,000 or so different cloud applications that are listed in the Azure Marketplace, that the work has already been done for you to leverage Azure AD as the directory service for those cloud applications. And just simply with some clicks, you can walk through and set that up very easily. But beyond even our catalog, really any SAML compliant application can also leverage Azure Active Directory as its directory service, and again, achieve that single sign-on or simplified sign-on depending on the application scenario. Now, in addition to cloud applications, we also have a service called the Web Application Proxy, which is designed to take on-premise web applications and make them look, act, and feel like cloud applications, to securely publish them externally without the need for the user to VPN into the environment, but have access to this application as if it were available everywhere, just like any cloud application. We can also leverage conditional access, which I'll talk about in a moment, to secure access to that application because it's being authenticated through Azure Active Directory. Also included, we have single sign-on with password reset with write back to AD. Self-service password reset with write back to AD. And this is really key, right, in order to help users be more self-sufficient when it comes to their credential set. But we've recently merged that with our conditional access and multi-factor authentication enrollment process. So now the user can enroll in one service, provide their mobile device details, and be enrolled for both self-service password reset, as well as have multi-factor capability for conditional access scenarios, which I'll drive into a little bit deeper in a second. Now, over on the P2 side, so this is an advanced license in Azure AD Premium, we have identity protection, privileged identity management. So identity protection leverages our Microsoft Intelligent Security Graph, which I'll go into in more detail, to look for credential sets or credential pairs that may have been leaked in the wild. And now we've got a user who represents a higher risk, and therefore we can treat them differently in conditional access scenarios. And I'll go through that in more detail. And then lastly, privileged identity management is really capitalizing on the fact that we all know it's a best practice not to operate with higher level privilege on a day-to-day basis. Really, a user should operate with their normal level of privilege and then escalate to a higher level of privilege as the need arises. With privileged identity management, we can do this escalation, gating it with things like multi-factor, and then expiring that higher level of access after a certain predefined period. So for example, a user may need admin rights. You can give them admin rights. You can MFA them to make sure that they are who they say they are, and then grant that access for a predefined period, let's say 6 hours or 8 hours or whatever's appropriate for that particular application. Really, the key from a security perspective is conditional access. So I'm going to dive into that a little bit further. Conditional access is looking at what are the conditions by which a user should be granted access to a particular application. And those conditions could be a number of different scenarios. Where is the user coming from? What network are they on? Are they on a trusted or compliant device? In other words, is this device managed by the organization? Is it healthy? Or are they connecting from their home PC? What is their user role? What groups are they in, right? And then physically, where are they? Do we want to treat them differently if they're traveling in less trusted countries, for example, for particular applications? And we can take all these conditions into consideration, as well as some machine learning policies with Azure Information Protection to look at user behavior to determine, does this user meet the right criteria to access the application, and what is the session risk associated with that user? And based on that criteria, what controls do we want to put in place to allow them to access the application? So for example, I work a lot with education customers. We all know that multi-factor authentication is a very good way to secure identities. However, if you're a teacher in the classroom and you're constantly getting bombarded with an MFA request on your day-to-day job, that's disruptive to the education process, right? So if a teacher is operating on a managed device by the organization on a network that's trusted, should the teacher be prompted for a second factor authentication when they're just checking their email? Maybe not. Likewise, if a user is traveling on vacation, right, they're off network, obviously MFA is a good thing to do to secure access to their email. Should they have access to payroll or finance applications or sensitive data when they're traveling outside the US and on vacation? That's a decision that each organization can make. But again, you can control the conditions by which a user can access any of the cloud services that are authenticated through Azure Active Directory using conditional access. Very powerful solution in this regard. Now, jumping forward, a lot of folks don't realize that under the new license model, if you are licensed for Microsoft 365, you actually have access to Microsoft Identity Manager as well. And this has long been our solution for synchronizing identity across disparate directory services. So, for example, taking identity from an HR and provisioning that throughout other directory services, where the HR system probably would be the source of record for the employee number, and then you'd build a total identity of the user and then flow those attributes to other systems as required. So Identity Manager is a key part to our identity strategy, and it's included as part of Microsoft 365 as well. Now, Intune actually is an interesting component of our identity strategy as well, in that it's a device management solution. So Intune started out as a mobile device management solution for iOS and Android, and over the past couple of years has grown into a solution suitable for managing Windows endpoints, so much so that we're seeing a strong transition from Active Directory joined Windows machines to Azure AD joined Windows machines managed by Intune. And Intune policies replacing group policies that came from Active Directory. So it's playing a key role in identity and access management. It's also playing a role in determining the health of the client to determine those conditional access parameters as well. If you haven't yet had the opportunity to look at an Azure AD joined Intune managed Windows environment, it really is quite a bit of a change from the traditional way of doing it, as I mentioned. The whole idea is to lower the cost of managing endpoints and make it easier. So we want to get customers out of the business of, for example, re-imaging machines, deploying operating systems, doing custom images, and all the heavy lifting associated with that, and get them into a more streamlined model where you can issue a PC to a user. It's got a plain Windows 10 image on it. When they log in, automatically it's enrolled in Azure Active Directory managed by Intune, and you can push down all the policies and personalization that's important to the organization. So it is a key part of management from a security perspective. Now, I talked about the intelligent security graph as part of conditional access, but I'm going to elaborate a little bit further on what this is. So the intelligent security graph is our collection of signal data that we receive from operating cloud properties worldwide. So if you look at the scope of the infrastructure that Microsoft manages, from our public and private cloud properties to endpoints that we update via Windows Update, there's a lot of signal data and intelligence that we gather from that, as well as our partners through third-party relationships. And that signal data can be used in a lot of different scenarios. So for example, in conditional access rules, as I mentioned, if a user's credential set has been found in the wild to be compromised, we can go ahead and change those conditional access parameters based on that. But we also have valuable information about source locations. So for example, we know if a user is connecting from an anonymous proxy. We know if we're seeing connections from known botnets or compromised hosts on the internet. And that plays a role in security decisions for all of our solutions. The intelligent security graph is about 40 terabytes a day of signal data that makes up all this information. And as you see as we go forward, it plays a role in a lot of different areas. So let's shift gears to threat protection. I think we would all agree the most common attack vector for end users today is still email. through various phishing campaigns, malware embedded in attachments, and so forth. And we have a pretty robust strategy around email protection. It starts with Exchange Online protection. So our core email filtering from a spam perspective and malware is Exchange Online protection. And this service actually uses 3 different anti-malware engines because defense in depth strategy, basically makes sense to run through messages through multiple engines, different engines update at different rates, and so forth. 2 of those engines are third parties. One is our engine, and that between the 3 of those is going to constitute catching the majority of known malware that comes in through email. However, we've moved beyond the known malware into the unknown space. So that's where Office 365 Advanced Threat Protection comes into play. And there are really 3 features associated with this. If email makes it through EOP, the next step is Advanced Threat Protection. Now, this is an advanced workload that, of course, is in our E5 or A5 license suite, but also available a la carte for those customers that are on A3 or E3. There are really 3 features in this space. The first one is safe attachments. This is where we take an attachment that comes through via email, often to a virtual machine called a detonation chamber, and we execute that attachment. We're looking for the behavior associated with that attachment. So for example, let's say it's a PDF. If it's a PDF, we open it up in multiple versions of Acrobat, and we look for its behavior. A PDF should not cause network traffic. It should not cause writes to a file system, right? It's a document. But we do know that there are malformed PDFs out there that have bad behavior. So based on the behavior in the detonation chamber, we can either discard or allow that attachment through. Now, the last step of any attachment that we scan in the detonation chamber is we hash that information and we send that back up the Microsoft Intelligence Security Graph where other solutions can leverage it. So for example, Exchange Online Protection, if it sees that same attachment again, rather than letting it through and having ATP scan it again, we know the result of that particular attachment, and EOP will take action, either blocking or marking it as safe and allowing it through. We've also expanded the safe attachment detonation concept beyond email to other workloads on Office 365. So for example, if you share a document in Teams, OneDrive, SharePoint, anything based on the SharePoint infrastructure, we're going to detonate that document as part of the sharing process as well, with the premise being that we don't want a compromised document sent from one user, spreading that compromise to other users as well. Now, the second feature is safe links. So the second part of malware associated or attacks associated via email is bad URLs, right? And really, there are 2 types of bad URLs. There's the type that leads to a payload download, where the user clicks on the link, a download happens, and they're infected, usually with ransomware or something similar to that. Now, we can follow those download links in the detonation chamber like we scan attachments. And that handles a great amount of those types of bad URLs. But the more common scenario that we're seeing is the scenario of phishing, right? So the user gets a URL, they click on it, they're convinced that they should give up some valuable information, usually their credential set, and now that credential set has been compromised. So for those types of URLs, we use something called safe links, where we rewrite URLs to a safe link and provide what's called time of click protection. The biggest challenge with bad URLs is timing, right? It's very easy to spin up a site that nobody knows about and send it out to a bunch of people. Over time, that URL gets known, and we can add that to a block list. So time of click protection is really the only way to provide protection in this area. Now, safe links, again, started out with email, and we've extended that to other workloads as well. So for example, in Word, Excel, PowerPoint, Visio, if you open documents with URLs, we will also safe link those. So when the user clicks on those URLs, we're checking those to see if they should be blocked or not. We also recently expanded this to Teams. Teams is our fastest growing product in the history of Microsoft. And so if you're sending messages between users, you're sending a URL, we're going to also safe link that. So when the user clicks on it, we'll look at that as well. We also do this for internal users. So if you're on Exchange Online, both safe attachments and safe links are performed for internal traffic. The idea behind that is we don't want a compromised user being used to compromise other users inside the organization and have those attacks move laterally. And then last feature of ATP is a relatively new feature called anti-impersonation. And this is really designed to deal with spoofing. Growing concern around email is, you get an email that looks like it's from somebody you know, but it's really been spoofed, sent from the outside. So we have a number of mechanisms inside ATP to deal with that, including the ability for customers to adjust how aggressive we are in attacking that type of approach. And including putting warnings on a message that say, hey, this is a message you received from George. You receive email from George frequently, but this may not be the George you think it is. So really giving the user pause to make sure that when they read the remainder of that message, if there's some unusual action there, that they don't take action blindly against it. So I mentioned ATP links to the intelligent security graph, and EOP learns from that. So that's the connection point there. The next piece to our strategy around advanced threat protection is Defender Advanced Threat Protection. So this is really designed to deal with advanced attacks at the client side. Not to be confused with Windows Defender, which has been the traditional antivirus solution built into Windows 10. Advanced Threat Protection is an EDR solution. It's looking for advanced threats, things that traditional AV is not going to catch. The good news here is this feature is actually built into Windows 10, so there's nothing that needs to be deployed. It just needs to be licensed and enabled. So it is part of the A5 E5 suite or available separately. When you enable it, basically the client signal data starts reporting up into your tenant, and you get visibility into what's going on with that client. So a lot of scenarios that you may see out in the wild, such as a person opens a document, which then causes a script to launch, which then launches PowerShell and schedules a task on the user's machine that's malicious. Those are the types of things that ATP can pick up on. And so a great amount of detail into what's going on the client, as well as a history. So we keep 6 months of data. So you can actually go back if you're seeing some abnormality in your environment, and you're wondering, do I have any other machines that have exhibited this in the past? You can go back and look at that data as far back as 6 months. So a lot of detail there. We recently also launched our native Mac client. So this is both Windows and Mac with additional platforms coming in the future. Before we relied on third parties to do this, and now we're native. Now, of course, these things tie into the intelligent security graph as well. So one of the areas, for example, is if Office 365 ATP has already detonated a document and found it to be malicious, Defender ATP is going to learn from that and vice versa. So we can actually block that client from being opened, or that document from being opened on the client if it's learned from Office 365 ATP and vice versa. So we're always communicating that information back and forth. Also, Defender ATP can give health data information back to Azure AD conditional access scenarios. So we can determine, is this machine healthy or not? And therefore, under what circumstances should this user get access to the application, depending on that scenario. Shifting gears over back to the identity side from an advanced threat perspective, I'm going to actually build this out. We have two different solutions that are looking at Active Directory security logs. The first one's called Advanced Threat Analytics. This is a server that you would stand up on premise. Of course, a virtual machine is fine as well. And you're taking Active Directory security log data and analyzing that log data for advanced attacks. Likewise, our cloud service, which is included in E5 and A5, is called Azure Advanced Threat Protection. And that's doing a similar thing, but the service is operating in the cloud. It's updated a little bit more frequently, so it's a little bit more time to value from that perspective. And what we're looking for here is about 30 or so at the moment known attacks against identity. And so oftentimes customers are not looking at Active Directory security logs unless something has happened and it's after the fact. This is trying to be a little bit more proactive and alerting you to events that are occurring. In fact, in the case of Azure ATP, we actually build a timeline of the user's identity where you can go and look and see, okay, Sally logged into this machine at this time, authenticated to this server, changed her password at this time, and her identity was attacked, the next day. Those types of things. So great visibility into what's happening from an on-premise directory perspective. Now, when we're talking the cloud, our power really comes from cloud app security. So one of the nice things about cloud app security, it's really giving us a vehicle to actually improve security by moving to the cloud versus a couple of years ago, I would get questions, hey, is it safe to move my data to the cloud? Now we're actually able to provide some security advantages. So Cloud App Security for Office 365 and Microsoft Cloud App Security are our cloud app security brokers. Cloud Obscurity for Office 365 is limited to just Office 365 workloads. And Microsoft Cloud Obscurity extends to third-party cloud workloads as well beyond Office 365. But in both cases, what they're looking at is behaviors of events that are occurring inside of those cloud services and giving you visibility and the ability to apply rules and take action based on those behaviors. So out of the box, we have a number of different rules that we create for you, things like the impossible travel scenario that's looking for logins and activities that occur in a foreign country minutes after those activities occurring domestically, the so-called impossible travel scenario. But really also the power here is to create your own rules, to look for certain activities and thresholds that are met and either alert on those or take action on those. I'll give you a small example. So I had a customer that was basically said to me, hey, it's great that Microsoft shuts down a Office 365 account if it sends more than 10,000 emails in a day, because that's usually an indication that that account's been compromised. They said, that's great, but really that's a really high threshold for us. We want to know on a lower threshold basis what our users are doing. So for example, if I see 300 messages in the period of an hour coming from a user, I want to know about this. Maybe I'm not going to take action initially, but I want to see what's going on. Likewise, if a user logs into SharePoint or OneDrive and downloads a large number of documents in a short period of time, I want to take action. I want to look at what's going on there. And that's really where Cloud App Security shines. It allows you to put rules in place to look for those sequences of events that are of concern to you. And you can certainly start with alerting, but if it's, every time you're looking at it, it is a compromised account or something more nefarious, you can actually take automated action, such as disabling the account and killing the user session, or kicking off a flow to automate some other process as well. So if you haven't had the opportunity to look at Cloud App Security, either for Office 365 or the full platform, I definitely highly recommend taking a look at that. And then lastly in this stack is Microsoft Threat Intelligence. This kind of brings it all together with a view into what's going on in the environment from a malware perspective. So we can look at things like, who are my top targets? What's the top type of malware being caught in the environment? We can run what-if scenarios such as, hey, I've heard about this piece of malware in the wild. Am I protected for across my environment for this? How does this malware propagate? What exactly does it do? So there's a lot of intelligence and learnings included in threat intelligence. And then we're also starting to add more proactive things in it, such as being able to do password attacks against your users to determine if there are weak passwords in the environment. Be able to do phishing attacks against your users and measure the effectiveness of that simulated attack to see, are my users executing best practices as they receive these emails, and are they suspect against phishing, or are they just blindly clicking, those types of things. So threat intelligence is also part of E3 and E5 and A5, or available a la carte as well. Now, all these protections are really designed to deal with all the things that we see across the attack kill chain. So I'm actually going to build this out. A lot of the things that we're seeing is, again, the phishing attacks. The user opens an attachment, clicks on a URL, then gets exploited. Now the attacker has command and control of that particular user's account or that device, or they're doing a brute force account against credentials, right? And attacking the user's account that's become compromised. But in most cases, what we're seeing is, unlike the years past where a compromised account or a compromised machine would be used to make a lot of noise, to either send a lot of spam outbound or something along those lines, we're seeing actually a lot more nefarious activity. We're seeing a lot of attackers that are sitting on accounts quietly and learning about the environment and moving laterally to accounts of higher privilege, either higher privilege from a domain dominance perspective, where they're trying to basically take over and own the environment, or higher privileged account that has access to important data, where they're trying to exfiltrate that data or gain access to account or cause a financial event to occur, right? And so our goal is to provide threat protection across all of these boundaries. So Office 365 ATP looking at the edge from an email perspective, Defender ATP looking at what's going on in the client to make sure that everything is safe there. And then Azure ATP is also looking at the identity piece. Are we seeing lateral movement where attackers trying to move from one account to another and so forth? And then lastly, of course, Cloud App Security, as I mentioned, is really getting good insight into what's going on from a cloud app perspective. And so this is kind of how all these pieces fit together, and how we're trying to attack this from all different directions. Now let's just shift gears a little bit and talk about information protection and the strategy around this. And certainly this strategy begins with DLP, or data loss prevention. So the Office 365 services have had data loss prevention associated with them for some time. We usually tend to talk about this in email context, although it is available for other workloads like any of the SharePoint libraries, Teams, OneDrive, etc. But really, when we think about data loss prevention, we're thinking about putting kind of a traffic cop, if you will, in front of data. So we're really trying to determine or trying to prevent the accidental or nefarious act of sending data outside the organization by putting rules in place. So, for example, the common scenarios we see is we don't want emails going outbound with credit card numbers. We don't want it going outbound with social security numbers, things of that nature, or any custom data types. So DLP inside of Office 365 includes at least 50 or so built-in rules to handle the common things, like, as I mentioned, credit card numbers, PCI compliance, HIPAA, things of that nature. But you can also create custom rules, and you can have custom events that look at the flow of this data. So, for example, if somebody sends an email with a credit card number, that's not a good thing, but we all know that tends to happen from time to time, usually when somebody's ordering catering services or something. But how do you want to take action on that? Now, if you see an email with 10 credit card numbers, now you know something is going on, right? So thresholds can play a role in your rule creation. You can take action in different ways, such as either informing the user with a policy tip to say, hey, I see that you're drafting this email that violates our information policy. Click here to learn more about that policy. You can hard block it, or you can copy a compliance officer every time an event occurs that hits a DLP rule. So data loss prevention is pretty well understood. It's been around for some time. We're actually extending this capability to our Defender Advanced Threat Protection as well, so we can take the DLP rules that govern the flow of data inside of Office 365 and apply those down to the endpoint as well, to make sure that the user's not taking that same data and copying it off to, let's say, a USB stick or some other service. But really, when we're talking about protecting information, the proper way to do that is through Azure Information Protection. So Azure Information Protection makes the assumption that, look, we're going to have sensitive data. That sensitive data needs to flow through the environment, needs to be able to be collaborated on. Otherwise, our users are just going to find some other method to exchange that sensitive information with other coworkers. So recognizing that this data exists, let's do the proper thing in labeling it, categorizing the data, and taking protection where that's warranted. And to show this, I'm going to kind of pull up an example here. So this is Azure Information Protection inside of Microsoft Word. And of course, any of the Office applications, email can use AIP, and now PDFs as well. So Adobe as a first-party citizen in the Azure Information Protection space as well. But here in this particular example, I've got 5 different data classifications: non-business, public, general, confidential, and highly confidential. Now, in my opinion, 5 is probably too many. And honestly, if I look at this, could I tell the difference between general and non-business? Maybe not. But you as an organization can decide, what should the title of these be? What should the descriptions associated with each of these categorizations are? And you can completely customize this for your organization, but also for different users. So depending on your user community, you can have more categorizations for one set of users versus others, whatever's appropriate for your organization. So in this example, so there's some of these categories that just label. So when I choose general or public or non-business, for example, I'm just simply labeling the data. It's getting saved in the metadata of the document. And now as I work with this data, I understand its categorization, right? When we get into confidential and highly confidential, this is where we're actually going to encrypt the data. And no matter where this document is stored, that encryption goes forward with it. So if I give this document, if I mark it as confidential and I say this is confidential, Microsoft FDE employee only, and I give this document to a friend on a USB stick, no matter where he or she tries to open it, will not be able to access it because he or she does not have FDE credentials to do so. And furthermore, as that person tries to open it, that activity is also logged and auditable. So there's a complete audit trail for each one of these documents as well. So likewise, if I move forward and say, okay, this thing's going to be marked confidential, which we've done, right? Now this is confidential Microsoft FDE only. And I get this document as an FDE. I open it. I have access to this super secret information. That's great. And I said, you know what? I don't think this needs to be confidential. It really needs to be public. When I go to mark it as public, I'm asked to provide a justification, right? And as I do this, this justification is also logged and is part of the audit trail. So at this date and time, from this IP address, Michael did move it from confidential to public. This is what happened with the document, if we allow to do so. Now, there's other things you can do in AIP, such as you can mandate a watermark. You can say, okay, if this document's confidential, it's going to have a watermark throughout the document that can't be removed. That says it's confidential. So there's a lot of different options that you can do in the deployment of AIP. But basically what we're talking about is protecting content no matter where it goes. And if I come back to our chart here of different solutions, we also can tie AIP back into Cloud App Security. So in Microsoft Cloud App Security, I can do a couple of things. One is I can say, all right, if I see a mass download of information from a SharePoint site, let's say a couple hundred documents in a short period of time, are those documents classified as confidential, or are they classified as general? My behavior and the action that I want to take may be quite different if those documents are all confidential documents than it would be for just general documents, right? Furthermore, you can mix this in with conditional access scenarios to say, look, I don't want my users accessing confidential information in Office 365 when they're traveling abroad on vacation, let's say, or in certain countries. So you can do that with Microsoft Cloud App Security and block access to that sensitive data type if you've taken the time to, again, classify. Now, when you get into AIPP2, you can get into what's called automatic classification, where I can go and say, all right, based on this criteria, these rule sets, I'm going to automatically set the classification of the content, not relying on the user to do the right thing, but doing it systematically. I can also go out and scavenge file shares or SharePoint sites and go out and reclassify documents that already exist in the environment with Azure Information Protection P2, which is part of A5 or E5, but also available separately. Okay, so that's a lot of information. I hope that's helped you in going through how these pieces fit together, where they fit in our overall security strategy. I'm going to shift back over to the license slide also, because I know there's a lot of different pieces I talked about, many of which I mentioned were either part of A5 or E5, and some of them that were in the core A3 and E3. But with that, I'll open it up to any questions. I'll look in the IM window too to see if there are any questions associated.
Hey, Michael, it's George. You mentioned that they can purchase ATP via a la carte, but
correct.
Isn't there also a bundle for E3 for compliance and for security? Can you talk about those real quick? Yes,
absolutely. I'm glad you brought that up. So I didn't include it in our discussion today from a licensing perspective, but as I mentioned, we've had this E3, A3, and E5, A5, depending on which business classification you are, for about 2 years or so. And there's quite a bit of price difference between the two bundles. So we had a lot of requests for something in the middle, right? So because of that, we've come out with A5 security and A5 compliance bundles that basically pluck out those pieces like security, for example, and put them in a separate suite and are priced kind of in between the 3s and the 5s, if you will. So for example, advanced threat protection for Office 365, Azure ATP, Defender ATP, all bundled together with threat intelligence, for example, in the A5 security bundle or the E5 security bundle. And that's been very popular as well, because a lot of customers are not ready necessarily for the other solutions that are in the 5 suite, such as the phone system or cloud PBX, audio conferencing, the Power BI platform, et cetera. But they really want the core security features or the core compliance features. And they're available as separate bundles as well. So great question.
Any other questions?
Oh, there's a question in the IM window. Where do I get a list of applications that can work with SSO? Certainly, if you do a search out there for the Azure Marketplace, the Azure Marketplace for Azure Active Directory will list all of the partner applications that we've already done the work to document how to configure them. So last I checked, it was about 3,000 or so different applications in there. And again, depending on the nature and the design of the application, some of those would be true single sign-on, and some of those would be what I kind of refer to as simplified sign-on, right? So it maintains the same credential set, but the user would get prompted to authenticate again. And then the way you can leverage those applications is a couple of different ways. So we have what's called a My Apps portal, which is a portal, myapps.microsoft.com. When you log into it, it will show you all the applications that you have access to that are authenticated to Azure AD. There's also a mobile portal application for iOS and Android for that. Or you can also publish them on the launcher in Office 365, which of course some people will refer to as the waffle in the upper left-hand corner. So third-party applications can be dropped right on the launcher, and then of course your users can switch back and forth between Office 365 apps and third-party apps as well.
All right, going once, going twice, going 3 times for questions. I want to thank Michael for joining us. This was a great presentation, Michael. I think this was a really good job of sort of concisely breaking down a lot of topics and talking about how our customers can get benefit from the platform and how all the pieces fit together and why you need which pieces. So I thank you very much for joining us today.
Oh, thank you, Bob. I know there's a lot of pieces to the puzzle, and a lot of times customers will want to go deeper in particular subject areas. So I'd say work with your account teams, work with your partners like Planet to drive in deeper to those areas. There's a lot of expertise on how to do this out there, and we're happy to help.
Thank you. So in wrapping up, this presentation was brought to you by Azure Advantage and Office 365 Advantage. Those are managed services that Planet have to help you sort of navigate all of these types of conversations, right? To help sort of there's a number of models, right? But one of the most popular ones being the ability to sort of rent a CTO to help guide and steer these conversations over time. Because as an example, if you were an Office 365 customer and you bought 3 years ago and Planet helped you and we talked about everything you could do then, we are light years from where that place was in cloud time. And so, staying connected, having access to architect level resources. I'm not sure what that was. I'm going to mute everybody. So, having access to those, high quality architect level resources to help guide you and navigate you through that process can be very beneficial. And with that, if there are no final questions, we will close out for the month. Thanks everybody for joining. Have a great month. We'll see you next month. Thanks.